The great flood of troops that would cross the Atlantic began with a trickle. A detachment from Base Hospital No. 4 sailed on May 8, 1917. On June 14, 1917, elements of the U.S. 1st Division, the Big Red One, sailed for France. The 26th Yankee Division, comprised of New England National Guard troops, sailed in September, followed by the 42nd Rainbow Division. Shipping was a problem from the beginning. The U.S. Merchant Marine was comparatively small and there were almost no troopships capable of making the voyage to France and back. In turn, German ships were seized, among them the Vaterland, the largest passenger ship in the world at that time. Renamed Leviathan, she carried almost 100,000 Americans to France during the war. Other shipping was chartered from neutrals or loaned by the Allies, but not until the spring of 1918, when the British released large numbers of ships to the effort, did the trickle of American troops become a torrent. From April 1 to October 31 more than 1,600,000 troops made the trip. In July alone, 306,350 doughboys sailed for Europe. 4 out of every 5 doughboys sailed from New York Harbor, leaving from the piers at Hoboken. Most of the rest sailed from Newport News, Virginia. The average trip took 14 days. From Chattanooga to Camp Merritt our trip was a triumphal procession. Red Cross women met us at the stations, showering us with gifts, whistles blew, and everyone shouted and waved flags. The intensity of enthusiasm steadily increased as we went north, until in Pennsylvania it passed all bounds. Every whistle and bell within miles was playing tunes, people crowded the windows of houses and factories, everybody's hat was off, everybody was yelling himself hoarse. Red Cross ladies at every station with apples and cigarettes, pretty girls shaking hands with us through the car windows. I was quite drunk with the excitement of it. The most touching sight was the intense patriotism old people displayed. Time and again, we would see an old bent, gray-haired woman waving a great flag at us, or an old man swinging his hat and cheering like a boy. We left the train at Long Island and took the ferry for New York. It seemed rather foolish to me to see the way they were trying to camouflage our movements, as it was broad daylight, and anyone with any sense would know that we were going to a transport. We arrived at Pier 59 about 12:30. Great precautions had been taken by the government to prevent people from seeing any of the transports. The docks were all boarded up, and we even found the gangplank to the vessel was boarded up. Once on board we were immediately ordered below deck and were assigned to different sections. It is likely that much the greater part of our boys had never before been on a ship. Probably a majority had never even seen an ocean-going vessel. How crude were the ideas of some of these country lads may be surmised from the fact that occasionally considerable numbers of them on a ferry en route from Jersey City to a Brooklyn pier would suppose that already they were off for France and would make anxious inquiries as to the probable date of arrival. On certain days the chaplain was asked to remain at the pier office, at Hoboken, which proved at last to be quite a romantic spot. Here he officiated at many last-minute weddings. Some were the result of a tearful girl's inability to wait out the war, others born of a natural dread that the soldier might never return, still others, the hasty romances of a week, or even a day. In some instances refusal to officiate was a necessity. Not a few girls of the street attempted to prey on soldiers by marrying 2, or even 3, at different places, in the hope of being mailed the soldiers' pay from their alleged husbands during the war. On leaving New York each man was furnished with postcards with the printed statement, "The ship on which I sailed has arrived safely overseas," which he might sign and address to whom he pleased. These were taken up and held in New York till the safe arrival of the boat was cabled back, and then were released for mailing. The line going up the gangplank was moving slowly. The men seemed to have lost their voices. The checker was having difficulties in understanding the names and numbers, even though the rolls had been arranged in the order of the march of the men. Finally I stood abreast the checker and yelled at the very top pitch of my voice, "Emmett! Christopher! ASN! 2,807,274. And Bill Goodson, following immediately upon my heels and catching the humor of the thing, pitched his piercing stentorian voice above the hubbub and far above my effort and notified the surrounding world that he, too, was going aboard. The checker tilted back his chair and looking up at us shouted, "Thank God! America is saved. 2 live soldiers going to France." Each man was given a cloth tag which was to serve as his meal ticket besides showing the number of his hatch, letter of his deck, number of his bunk and raft or boat number. This tag was to be worn at all times and to be punched at each meal. Our bunks were made entirely of steel and were in tiers of 3 which made each man so close to the next that the air seemed very close. One had the same sensation that a man does going into a mine for the first time. We were all compelled to stay below until dinner time but allowed on the decks all afternoon. Our mess line seemed about a mile long and led through various passages and down stairways to the very bowels of the ship. And our food being cooked with steam and not seasoned was about as palatable as a wet sponge. On the afternoon of May 17, 1918, we boarded our ship, the SS Calamares. She was one of the White Fleet of the United Fruit Company. A banana boat that carried the fruit of Central America to the United States. She had accommodations for passengers because that was also a part of the business. She still sported the company white diamond painted on her buff-colored smokestack. Otherwise she had splotches of green and gray paint on her hull, forming grotesque shapes that were called camouflage. All ships were either painted a dull gray or with camouflage stripings which blended into the seascape very well. The Calamares was a small ship. Into her hold on the various decks were long aisles of bunks made of 2x4 wood frames and chicken wire to support straw-filled mattresses. These framed-up bunks were 3 tiers high. Chicken wire stretches. The poor fellows in the bottom bunks were dragging their anchors after a few days. We could endure the bunks, but the odor of bananas permeated the whole ship. Access to the hold of the ship where our bunks were located was through the large cargo hatches in the fore and after well decks. It was up and down the ladders we would go morning, noon and night or as restlessness demanded. Below decks there were continuously running crap games, red dog, poker and others I had never heard of. Some of those fellows never saw daylight the whole trip. I do not remember the exact train of my thoughts. I only know that I was held spellbound by the wonder of the fact that here I was active ally going to war, I who but a few years before had hardly turned aside a moment from the leisures of my summer vacation to read in the papers of the beginning of a war in Europe. What was before me now? Large ships were curiously painted with huge stripes and curves of black and white and vivid colors, until even at a short distance their own builders would not have known them. There, lying against the island were 2 small vessels, one behind the other, looking so insignificant that no one would ever waste a torpedo on them, and yet closer inspection reveals the optical illusion. It is really a fair-sized troopship cleverly disguised. Seen at close quarters, however, the camouflage looked as if it would attract attention rather than reduce visibility, and the most complimentary remark from the doughboys on board the closely packed ships was that the camouflage man had had a nightmare. The enlisted men eat in gangs, 1,000 at a sitting, rather a standing, for there are no seats, 5 shifts of 1,000 each stagger through the mess hall at each meal, never standing still but eating as they move. One must step fast or be pushed aside. Each man carries a tag which states his sleeping shifts, his eating shift, his bunk section and his abandoned ship station. There was also a canteen on board but the prices were so exorbitant that it was far beyond our means to purchase anything. We were compelled to pay 15 cents for an ordinary 5-cent bar of chocolate and 20 cents for a ham sandwich in which it was some job to find the ham. Oranges sold for 25 and 50 cents each. A great part of the goods that were being sold by the crew was supposed to be issued to us. The boat was not operated by naval officers and crew, but by a private concern. All garbage was deposited in containers on the deck and dumped overboard on favorable nights. It can readily be seen that if several thousand men were allowed to throw refuse overboard at will, the submarines would easily pick up your trail by following the garbage, and then it would be too bad for all concerned. We were allowed outside on deck at certain hours, and the refreshing air was a lifesaver. However, you are herded about by guards, soldiers and gobs, with the expression that becomes a famous bugaboo: "You can't stand there, soldier, you can't sit there, soldier, get the hell out of there, soldier." Very few of the boys became seasick until the second or third day, but when they did there was a rapid diminishing of the mess line. One boy who was feeding the fishes was asked by one of the comrades if he didn't have a weak stomach, and he replied, "Oh, I don't know. I guess I'm heaving it about as far as the rest of them." Whenever I think of seasickness, the picture rises to my mind of Jock McSweeney during the stormy weather. Full of fresh air and salt spray, I blew into the cabin. McSweeney was lying in his lower bunk with his eyes shut, passively sick for the moment. "Well, Jock, cheer up, it's great on deck. What are you doing down here all day?" His eyes stayed shut but his lips moved. His prayer was to the effect that the blank boat might sink to the bottom of the ocean and do it damn soon. Even this effort made him turn green about the gills. "Come on, snap out of it, Jock. Get a good meal aboard and you will feel fine." One corner of his mouth twitched as if in a sardonic smile. He gulped. His eyes opened but they didn't see. With a great effort he said in a whisper, "Get out of here, you bastard. If I'm ever on land again, by Christ, I'll come home by way of Siberia if I have to crawl on my hands and knees." This effort was too much for his tenderly balanced equilibrium and I got out just in time. How wise I had been in taking an upper berth. On about the fourth day, we neared the danger zone and were introduced to a new outdoor pastime commonly known as abandoned ship drill. At the blast of the bugle, the soldiers would don their life belts and proceed to an assigned section on deck. In addition to wearing life preservers, the extra equipment worn for the drill was one blanket, rolled up over the shoulder, and woolen gloves. After arriving at our station, we would receive instructions as how to go overboard in case of necessity. A seasoned naval officer growled out orders to the effect that, if we had to leave the ship, we would first throw the rafts overboard and then jump into the water. As soon as we were in the ocean, which he claimed was not cold, we were to kick the raft away from the sides of the ship, so as to prevent other rafts from coming down on our heads. We were told not to sit on the rafts, but to hang on the sides. At once, we figured that the blankets and woolen gloves were to keep us warm while in the ocean. Undoubtedly, the uppermost thought in everyone's mind was the reliability of the lifebelts. With not enough lifeboats to accommodate all the troops aboard, some were to use rafts. We drew the latter. Rumors had it that some life preservers would hold out 18 hours while others would sink with the wearer upon striking the water. Fortunately, the question remained unsettled. Several different types of life rafts were in use, but in the end the Navy found the donut-shaped raft to be the most satisfactory and the easiest to handle. These are merely hollow cylinders, donut-shaped, provided with rope hang-ons around the perimeter, and having a lattice floor in the interior. Life rafts of this kind required no launching and could be dropped overboard without risk of danger to the raft. The larger rafts had a flotation power sufficient to support 40 men. In addition, there was a large supply of life preservers, always in excess of the carrying capacity of the ship. In the early stage of the war our life preservers were of cork. Later it was found that the Kapok life preserver was more serviceable. The most minute precautions were taken to avoid trouble. First of all, every flashlight, every box of matches, and every cigarette lighter was required to be turned in. Anyone who wanted to smoke could borrow a light from one of the sailors. Immediately after sundown the decks were cleared and the doors and portholes closed, so that no light could escape. At an early hour in the evening the lights in the staterooms and cabins, as well as in the men's quarters below decks, were extinguished and the only illumination was the ghastly and feeble light emitted by a few small incandescent globes of blue glass. Nothing must be thrown into the sea lest it serve as a clue to our presence. The white caps of the sailors must not be worn after sundown. Portholes are closed after dark. Of entertainment, on board, there was little. The ship boasted a moving picture machine, which was used every night in the mess hall. But there were so many thousand troops on board, and the difficulties of getting from one place to another were so great, especially after the watertight doors were closed between compartments at night, that our men never had but one chance to go to a show, and few of them succeeded in getting there even then. But the band used to play on deck, and sometimes the men would gather round and sing. Hail, hail the gang's all here, in the artillery, and over hill, over dale. What little exercise they got was in the form of calisthenics. Every morning each organization marched up to the long promenade decks, and there the men, peeling off their blouses, were put through a short, snappy physical drill. Once or twice there were some boxing bouts. There was much discussion of the submarines among the men. Bets were laid on our chances for coming through alive, the odd negatives to these bets little stopping to consider what they would do with the money they won in case their expectations came to pass. The submarine discussions always reached their high points following lifebelt and lifeboat drills. There was supposed to be an order requiring each man to sleep in his hammock, but we were below the water line, and we knew the hopelessness of the trap should a torpedo pierce the boat's hull. Consequently, many of us who drew positions far back from the hatchway, folded our hammocks on the hard deck, made pillows of our life jackets, and, with our overcoats as cover, passed each night in the belief that, in the event of emergency, we would have at least a fighting chance to make the hatchway and get above. Considering the public furor over German submarines, the crossings went relatively unscathed. Successful attacks were limited by the convoy system, speed, and the difficulty of finding the ships on widely dispersed shipping lanes. U-boats succeeded in torpedoing 5 large troopships. 3 of the 5, Antilles, President Lincoln and Covington, sunk and were lost. The other 2, the Finland and Mt. Vernon, made it back to port. All 5 were on return voyages to the U.S. when attacked and carried few military passengers. Among the transports sunk on the way to France were the Tuscania on February 5, 1918, Moldavia on May 23, 1918, and the animal transport Ticonderoga on September 30, 1918. A total of 215 soldiers and sailors went down on the Ticonderoga, 56 men from the U.S. 4th Division were lost on the Moldavia and 230 were lost on the Tuscania. On the afternoon of February 5 we rounded the north of Ireland on the Tuscania and were proceeding southward. On either side we could dimly discern the cliffs of Scotland and those of the rocky Irish coast. The earliest knowledge we had of the proximity of a German submarine was a decided shock which rocked the big ship from end to end. Simultaneously all lights went out and a deafening crash echoed and re-echoed through the ship. There was no question we had been hit, and so, life belts on, we rushed for our stations. Our boat drills had been perfunctory ones at the best. Before the crash had died away every man was on his way to his post. The corridors, passageways and stairways were a seething mass of olive drab streaming for the decks. The rush was devoid of all hysterical excitement. Each man was excitedly cautioning his neighbor to take it easy, don't rush, don't crowd, she isn't sinking. Yet was using his elbows, feet and hands in regular mess line tactics to further a speedy arrival at his lifeboat. The torpedo had struck us squarely amidships on the starboard side. A great hole was torn in the hull and all the superstructure directly above was a mass of wreckage. Several sets of davits with their lifeboats were utterly demolished, thus diminishing the chances of getting away safely. From the minute of the explosion the ship began listing to starboard. It became exceedingly difficult to walk on deck, and more than one of the boys on losing his grip on the port rail would find himself sprawled against some of the deck machinery, a keg of rope or even the rail on the lower side. These 10 or 15 minutes elapsing from the moment we were struck were filled with action. With all indications of a speedy sinking staring us in the face, we worked feverishly to lower the lifeboats and cut away the rafts. Pitch darkness made our work more difficult. Here and there a pocket flashlight came into play. Later the auxiliary lights were turned on and we could better see what there was to do. The work of lowering the lifeboats proved discouraging. Not only had we lost several, due to the terrific effects of the explosion, which had thrown a sheet of flame and debris 100 feet into the air, but we discovered the boat tackle in many cases to be fouled or rotted and unfit for use. Some of the first boats we attempted to lower were capsized in midair, spilling their occupants into the icy water. The high seas running and the darkness made the rescue of these men almost impossible. Occasionally we got a boat away in good shape with nothing more serious than sprung planks or missing rain plugs. These difficulties were overcome by bailing with service hats, which served the purpose very well. On the port side the launchings were accompanied with another handicap. The Tuscania had acquired such a list that we found it necessary to slide the lifeboats down the rivet-studded sloping side of the ship with the aid of oars as levers. In all some 30 lifeboats were launched, and perhaps 12 of these were successful. After acquiring a heavy list, the Tuscania seemed to sink no lower in the water. Of those on board, though, the haste to go somewhere else abated not a bit. With the lifeboats gone together with the rafts, the situation looked none too encouraging. The boys showed few signs of nervousness. Standing there, lining the rail, waiting for the next development, some 600 of them smoked or talked quietly, discussing their plight. The remarkable part of it all was that they took everything in a matter-of-fact way with a sort of "well, what's next?" attitude. Occasionally a few would sing some little song, indicative of their feelings, such as "Where do we go from here, boys?" or "To hell with the Kaiser." The absence of any panic or effort and time in prayer was notable. Suddenly on the starboard, out of the darkness, a tiny destroyer came sidling up to the troopship. With a display of seamanship nothing short of marvelous, she approached near enough for the men to be transferred to her deck. Sometimes almost hidden by the roll of the big ship, the destroyer clung to us. Ropes were let over the side and several hundred of the boys went over. When the destroyer was loaded to the limit she steamed away, leaving a few boys dangling from the 60-foot ropes. It was here that one of our cooks, a 200-pound specimen, surprised us all and no less himself, by climbing all the way up to the deck again. When asked to demonstrate his feat a few days later in our Irish camp, he was unable to climb the height of the rafters in our barracks. Shortly after the departure of the destroyer load of troops, another one sidled up to us and completed the work of rescue. She, too, was crowded to the limit, but she stayed till every known person on board had been transferred. No sooner had she pulled away when some of the longitudinal bulkheads gave way, admitting the water to the port holds. Slowly the Tuscania resumed an even keel. Very low in the water and considerably so in the bow, she floated for another hour. At about 10 o'clock, 4 hours after being struck, she took her final plunge. With a muffled explosion as the water reached her boilers, she gently slid, bow first, under the surface. During all this time the lifeboats and rafts were drifting helplessly about. It was impossible to make any headway with the oars, as most of the boats were full of water, and there was such a heavy sea that any such effort was useless. In and out among these boats the destroyers raced, looking for traces of the submarine and dropping depth bombs where there were any suspicious indications. Each time one of the ash cans exploded the boats would shiver and shake with the concussion. Those men who were in the water were knocked breathless with each explosion, and in a few cases were rendered unconscious. While the work of abandoning ship was in progress, our rescuers were added to by a number of trawlers and smaller fishing boats which helped in gathering in the survivors. These vessels together with the destroyers combed the vicinity picking up men in lifeboats and rafts. Each bit of wreckage was closely scanned on the possibility of there being someone clinging to it. In this way the majority of the living were rescued. A few swimming alone and helpless were left. Darkness and the wide area over which the rafts and boats were scattered made it impossible to find them all. 3 lifeboats, each more than filled with its complement of men, were overlooked. Among the first away from the big ship, they had drifted quite a distance before the rescue work had fairly commenced. With no guidance and at the mercy of the wind and waves, they drifted aimlessly for several hours and then were dashed upon the cliffs of the Isle of Islay, Scotland. Out of more than 60 men in one of these boats, there were but 8 saved. Of the doughboys headed overseas, about half disembarked in England and the others landed in France. Most of those who landed in England went directly to Liverpool, transferred to trains and were then ferried across the English Channel. Most doughboys who went directly to France came through Brest, though others landed at Saint-Nazaire, Bordeaux and other ports. Toward the late afternoon the destroyers left us and we saw, far away, a grey tower. We drew nearer. The chimneys of a city and then its general outlines evolved themselves out of the fog and smoke. We entered the River Mersey and progressed toward the Liverpool docks. Crowded ferries dashed by and we cheered them just as we had cheered the New York ferries 2 weeks before. We cheered the other ships of our convoy as we passed them. The band played furiously. We cheered every tug and rowboat, every floating log or orange peel. We sang Over There / which we were not yet fed up with. We made the waterfront echo for an hour. Then, since we were not to land that night, we subsided and began to look round at the crowded shipping, the docks, the buildings on shore, the 2-storied electric tramcars, and all the sights of interest. Dominating our vision, commanding the waterfront from the center of a park, was a thing which of all others we saw and remembered. A sign, black, 20-foot letters on a white ground, reading, not welcome, not even, cable crossing, do not anchor here / but, who would have guessed it, Sprat's dog biscuit. As we marched down the street at Southampton to the Channel transport, again, goodbye, Broadway. Hello, France. Was taken up all along the line. Little children, tots 2, 3 and 4 years old, lined the sidewalks for blocks and patted our hands, as we went swinging along, and cries of good luck, soldier boys, came from all sides. We felt we were really beginning a wonderful thing. We were hiking through the dark streets of Southampton between rows of unlighted houses. A fine rain was falling, but there seemed to be many people on the sidewalks. They would hold out their hands to touch us in the dark. I shook several hands but saw no faces. A woman's voice said, "Keep your pecker up, laddie." The first halt found us still inside the city. Nevertheless, most of us took the opportunity of relieving ourselves in the gutter. The spectators, if the darkness makes this term permissible, took no notice. Many troops had passed through those streets since the beginning of the war. The entrance to the harbor of Brest is most picturesque, very quaint surroundings and very old-world looking. No giant buildings against the sky line, no giant ocean liners against the gigantic piers. Here and there an American liner which had landed her troops was anchored. Dotted along the shore were queer-looking little wooden boats or a string of barges such as we have seen being towed up the Hudson. The buildings were little low things such as we have seen in our geography and had laughed at their simplicity. I remember one remark which seemed to be appreciated by most of the men on deck who heard it. A Frenchman raised his cap and waved to the soldiers leaning over the rail and cried, "Vive l'Amérique! Vive les Américains!" A doughboy on the deck called back through his hands, "Vive yourself, you damned frog!" Before anyone got off, we were subjected to a lecture by First Lieutenant George Gould in the art of protecting our manly virtues. According to the lieutenant, we were in much danger of being raped the minute we put foot on French soil. Most of the fellows would have been very willing victims of such treatment. Leaving the quay behind we wind up a hill, while on either side of the road, kiddies besiege us with "Donnez-moi une cigarette pour le père dans la trenche." Shabby-looking little beggars, bare legs and huge wooden shoes that make a sound like a runaway horse as they clank-clank alongside of us. Big Sister was much in evidence too as she begged her share of ciggies. It was in Brest that we saw our first French soldier, better known to us as Froggy. So this was the chap we had come over to help out. A dirty field blue uniform, spirals of the same color, but behind this uniform of blue he had an elan we had no acquired as yet. We were carefree, we had not suffered the hardships he had endured, we were full of boyish enthusiasm. He had been that way back in 1914. The smaller boys lined the street asking for pennies and singing songs, the favorite of which was Hell. Hell. The gang's all here. Near the docks and in the railway yards we saw many small groups of German prisoners of war, with their little round skull caps and grayish-green uniforms, just as they had been captured and brought from the battlefields. Each group was guarded by a French sentry armed with a rifle with bayonet fixed. The sentry carried his rifle slung by the strap on his back, and any prisoner so minded could have been 2 blocks away before the Frenchman could have been ready to fire his piece. Just what sort of work the prisoners were performing could not be determined by us. Apparently they ceased operations when our column hove in sight and, as we passed them, they gazed at us with lackluster eyes and a look of apathy. The sentries were just as woebegone in appearance as the Germans and had a sad and lonesome mien. No one urged the prisoners to perform their tasks as we passed. They reminded us for all the world like flocks of sheep attended by their lazy shepherds. We had scarcely debarked and had drawn up in company formation on dock before a long train of hospital cars pulled in and stopped alongside us. We looked, and beheld, for the first time, the horrors of war, fresh from the line of battle. Every coach was full of men suffering from wounds. Heads were bandaged, arms and legs were missing, and body members were wrapped in tape. It was a trainload of English boys who had done their bit, whose bodies had been torn in the doing, and who were bound for Blighty, as they called England, to recuperate. The sight struck us dumb. Stout chaps among us looked and shuddered. "In the name of God, is that what we're headed for?" asked a husky lad at my side. "Looks bad, doesn't it?" I queried in reply. Presently, some of the wounded men in the coaches began to call to us. "Aye, Yanks! Aye, Sammies!" we responded. Then, American-like, we started a volley of questions. How lately had they been wounded? How long were they in France before they went up to the lines? How many did they leave behind? Did they think that we Americans would be put in action at once? All these and more. Nor were these cheerful, though crippled, English soldiers particularly consoling. "They need you where we came from, lads. You better have your wits about you, men. It's an L of a game, it is." We gained neither information nor solace from those broken lads. They were on their way to Blighty and nothing else mattered to them. It chilled us, everyone. If the scene had been staged with the view of hardening us, it could not have gone off better, except that, instead of feeling callous, we sensed fear and vague apprehensions. Captain Malcolmson of the 6th Manchesters, our British instructor, said, "I want to look your company over at close range as it marches by." As the company passed he inspected them closely and tears filled his eyes. He said, "My God! This is Kitchener's army over again. We have nothing like this now, we have nothing left but boys." General John J. Black Jack Pershing and the nucleus of officers that would comprise the headquarters of the American Expeditionary Force, the AEF, arrived in France in June. Also among the initial arrivals were elements of the 1st Division, made up of some of the oldest units in the regular army. Regiments such as the 18th Infantry, for instance, dated back to the War of 1812. One battalion of the 16th Infantry showed the flag in Paris during a 4th of July parade. With 2/3 of the outfit made up of recruits, they made a somewhat awkward appearance, but Paris loved it. "Vivent les Americans, vivent Pershing, vivent les Etats Unis," shouted the crowd as the U.S. flag passed by. Decked with wreaths and flowers, the doughboys marched to Lafayette's tomb where Pershing said a few not particularly memorable words. Honors went to a staff officer who summed up the spirit of the hour when he rose and announced, "Lafayette, we are here." Things were a bit less dramatic for most of the doughboys as they boarded trains and headed inland to various training areas. Our train was quite a long one and to our unaccustomed eyes the cars looked rather fragile and toy-like. They were freight cars of course and on the side of each car was painted in white letters, 40 hommes, 8 chevaux, 40 men or 8 horses. 40 men could get into one of these cars if they all stood up and 8 horses might be able to make it, also standing up. I do not know if the French poilus traveled so crowded, but we never did. The war would have ended as far as the American doughboy was concerned if he was compelled to. There were at least 20 to 30 men in each car. The cars had been swept out and were fairly clean. There was fresh straw for us to lie on, the only time this happened. There were a few times later on when we shoveled the manure and smelly straw from the cars before we could or would ride in them. Back of each residence was a dung pile carefully thrown high by the frugal hands of the Frenchmen, a reeking, stinking, stench pot, crying out to high heaven. What a smell! And the French objected when we removed it. Their wealth was measured by the height of their pile. On the side of each box car was marked 40 hommes, 8 chevaux, which means that either 40 men or 8 horses can be crowded in. One lad said, "We came across the water like a bunch of bananas and now we are to be shipped like a lot of horses." The towns occupied by the regiment were typical French country villages. A winding street, lined with stone and plaster houses, each one like its neighbor, and all like those in every town of its size in the district, red-tiled roofs and cobblestone streets. No gutters, and before every house the inevitable pile of manure, such is the prevailing pattern on which French villages are cut. The dwellings combined the house and barn under one roof which, while economical in some ways, had its drawbacks. The family lived on one side of the ground floor and the other side was devoted to barn purposes. The farmer had only to step out of his kitchen door to take care of his stock, but vice versa it was just as easy for the chickens and pigs to enter the kitchen. Over home and stable there was always a large open hay mow and it was in these lofts that the majority of the men were billeted, sleeping in the straw. Hitting the hay and going to bed with the chickens ceased to be merely figures of speech. I censored a letter in which one of our lads said, "There are 3 classes of inhabitants in the houses, first, residents, second, cattle, third, soldiers." At Commères-la-Haute we were confronted with the first necessity always to be found in every French town, that of cleaning up the town. It was a small village of some 200 population, but there was more filth and dirt to the person than in any place ever seen by me. The cows and horses trailed through the streets of the place, early in the morning and late in the evening, distributing their dung as they walked, and before we could drill upon the streets of the town we became scavengers en masse. Most of our time was spent in small rural villages like Grand. These truly constituted the backbone of the French Republic. Small farms were located on the outskirts of these villages and the people could easily walk to work on them. By the time we got to France, the only males we would see in these villages were old men, young boys, and disabled French soldiers. The whole rural area was run by women. Women ran the farms, operated the stores and cafes, and for the most part they were a wonderful, strong-willed group of people. They received us with open arms, because we were among the first American troops to arrive. They had so little themselves, yet they generously offered us a portion of their bounty. The difference in language didn't mean a thing. Those of us from New York City were more sympathetic, I believe, than troops from other parts of the United States except perhaps from those other large cities where there were large numbers of foreign-born. Practically every New York kid knew a few words of German, Italian, or Yiddish and it didn't take him very long to learn a little French. Of course, Italian Americans caught on very easily. On the ship across, we had been issued a little pocket dictionary of French phrases. Well, it wasn't much of a dictionary, but it did help, and we were able to pick up enough of the language to get by. We had such fun trying to talk to the French people, because they so enjoyed the mistakes that we made. It just tickled them to death, and we joined in their amusement. The French soldier, or poilu, as he was called, wore a long overcoat which also served as a blanket at night, wrapped leggings, and he carried a gas mask, a haversack which contained du pain, black bread, and a canteen which contained vin rouge, as our men called it. All of them needed a shave and a bath. The streets were of cobblestone with no drainage, with plenty of dogs and cats in them. Here we were introduced to the French café, with its garçons, red wine, and cognac. We always went for the last when we could get it. We could not get any American cigarettes at all, and had to smoke a vile French cigarette, which they called La Grenade. It was a most appropriate name for it. Here we also met the French lighter, with its long cord and ignition on the end, which never worked. The French soldiers were intensely interested in the equipment of our land forces and in the uniforms of both our soldiers and sailors. They sought by questions to get an understanding of the various insignia by which the Americans designated their rank. One thing that they noticed was a small, round white pasteboard tag suspended on a yellow cord from the upper left-hand breast pocket of either the blue jackets of our sailors or the khaki shirts of our soldiers. So prevalent was this tag, which in reality marked the wearer as the owner of a package of popular tobacco, that the French almost accepted it as uniform equipment. Not too far from where our platoon formations were held, there was a watering trough to which the natives would bring their animals to water, and alongside the trough was a hand pump where the people could draw water for house consumption. The trough was made of stone, probably hundreds of years old, and it had continuous running water coming from the nearby mountains and running through the farms and fields before flowing to this trough. Due to the fact that the French use all kinds of manure, including human, it was deadly to drink and we were ordered not to drink it. Even the French wouldn't drink this water, and even the poorest families drank wine. Blister bags were hung conveniently at different places in the village, and this water was chlorinated by the medical corps and was the only safe drinking water. It didn't taste very good, but it quenched one's thirst and was safe. Several times during extreme cold weather the water in these bags froze, but it would melt during the daytime when the sun was out, enabling us to fill our canteens. Beaumont was fortunate in having water from the mountain streams, clear and cold, piped right into the public square, but the troops in all the towns had to boil or chlorinate their drinking fluid. "Where are our latrines?" one of our officers asked Beaumont's mayor. "But, Monsieur le Commandant, we haven't any." "Well, what are the men to use?" "Why," exclaimed the French mayor, while a look of surprise came over his face that such a question should be asked, "why, you can use the streets." In fact, the inhabitants did use the streets, the whole family in most every case, and the few toilets in town were under lock and key. We were issued 2 round aluminum identification tags, dog tags, we called them, and the tags had our names, ranks and serial numbers. At this time we were reminded that if we were captured by the enemy the only information to give was what was on our dog tags and nothing else. With these tags was issued a yard of white cotton tape about half an inch wide. One tag was tied in a loop, lower than the other loop by 3 inches, and it could be cut off without loosening the security of the other loop around the neck. The tags were to be worn in this position at all times, the reason being that if anyone was killed, the chaplain or whoever was in charge of the burial detail would cut the lower tag off and turn it over to the graves registration department. The other tag would remain on the body, and a rough description of just where the body was buried went with the tag taken off the body. The number on my dog tag was 70,490, since we were among the first 100,000 American soldiers to land in France as the American Expeditionary Forces. American combat forces were organized into divisions consisting of some 28,000 officers and men, larger than the Civil War Army Corps many of their grandfathers had served in. The American divisions were the largest divisions on the Western Front during World War I. British divisions numbered about 15,000 men, while French and German divisions numbered about 12,000 men each. The U.S. formation was the so-called square organization with 2 infantry brigades, each made up of 2 regiments. There were 3 machine gun battalions and 1 field artillery brigade with 3 artillery regiments. 1 trench mortar battery was assigned to each division. The infantry regiments had 3 battalions of 4 rifle companies, and 1 machine gun company each, and each company had 4 platoons. Each platoon had 2 sections of 4 squads each. An infantry regiment consisted of 114 officers and 3,720 enlisted men. 3 battalions, each consisting of 27 officers and 1,000 enlisted men. Much to the amazement of our French neighbors, we trained in all sorts of weather. When it rained, they went home to their comfortable billets. On one rainy occasion, they marched by some trenches which our men were digging. The bottoms of the trenches were filled with water, and every shovelful was about half water and half mud. This amused them no end, and Apwalu, who had picked up some American cuss words, yelled, "Hell, damn, you like, you know like," etc. To which one of the soldiers yelled back, "Willallah you frog sob." This kind of exchange was frequently heard between our men and theirs. All our training that summer was along the lines of trench warfare. Early one morning, right after breakfast, we marched out to the training area, met the French officers, and the day's work started. We dug a series of trenches. We took up the new method of bayonet fighting. Long lines of straw-stuffed figures hanging from a cross-beam between two upright posts were set up. The men fixed bayonets and charged them. British instructors, who had arrived shortly after us, stood over them and urged them on. The men had to scramble in and out a series of trenches before they got to the swinging dummies. That was to improve their wind. When the dummies were reached, according to the British instructors, you must put on a fighting face, grunt and curse as you lunged, and literally try to tear the dummy to pieces with the thrust. There was special instruction to bayonet them in the belly wherever possible. If you bayonet a man you were chasing, you must get him through the kidneys and not in the rump. If your bayonet stuck, shoot it out. The British at that time were crazy about the bayonet. They knew it was going to win the war. The French were equally obsessed with the grenade. They knew it was going to win the war. So we also got a full dose of training in hand grenade throwing. For qualities the soldier must possess to attack effectively with the bayonet: nerve, good direction, strength and quickness. The charge with the bayonet should be made amid excitement, amid shouting and noise, for men kill best when little time is had for reflection. 5 feet is the greatest killing range, 5 feet from eye to eye. Don't stop to measure. Watch your opponent's eyes, not his feet. Rush at the enemy, holding the bayonet level with his throat, and as you come within plunging range, do not lose the 1/5 of a second which determines whether you or he will be killed. The surgeon dresses few bayonet wounds. Vulnerable parts of the body are the face, chest, lower abdomen, and if the back is turned, the kidneys. A cut in the armpit is as fatal as a plunge into the throat. 6 inches is deep enough for a thrust, else the bayonet cannot be withdrawn. If it sticks, fire a round to loosen it. Many men have been killed by others of the enemy while trying to pull the bayonet out of the killed man beneath them. When the knife comes out, if the air is sucked in, the wounded man begins to bleed inside, feels pain, and quickly gives up the spirit. If the enemy parries the thrust and the fray is at close quarters, kick him on the kneecap or in the crotch. Don't chase a fleeing enemy to stab him in the back, shoot him. We were given automatic rifles which the French call shoo-shoo guns. They were heavy, unwieldy affairs, hard to carry and none too accurate. But at close range they were wicked and tremendously effective. We learned to take the shoo-shoo apart and put it back together blindfolded, naming each of the many parts as we did so. The magazine carried from 15 to 18 shells and the fire could be made very rapid if necessary. We usually fired it in bursts of 2 or 3. The French automatic rifle was never made to hit anything. In fact, the claim was that it was purposely constructed to produce a scattering fire effect, and this it surely did, something on the principle of a shotgun, except that it fired 1 cartridge at a time. It was a cheap-made affair and likened to gas pipe by our men, who did not like it and had no confidence in it whatsoever. If noise counted for anything, it can be said that it performed very creditably in that respect. Each squad had 2 automatic rifles and 4 ammunition bags of 2,500 rounds to carry. We took turns carrying the ammunition bags. When they checked up after a hike, my squad had only 1,800 rounds left all told. What a bawling out they give us. Each of the boys throwed away a couple of handfuls every time it come his turn to carry. We took turns carrying the ammunition bags. When they checked up after a hike, my squad had only 1,800 rounds left all told. What a bawling out they give us. Each of the boys throwed away a couple of handfuls every time it come his turn to carry. I throwed away plenty myself. Until this time we had all worn the broad-brimmed felt campaign hats. Designed primarily for wear in the tropics to protect the soldier from the sun and rain, they were impractical in France and, upon issue of the small and much more useful cloth overseas caps, were all discarded. It is said they were reclaimed into slippers to be used by the wounded in hospitals. On November 2, 1917, we received our trench helmets. At first they felt quite heavy on our heads, but it didn't take long before we got used to them and wore them every day, except when we had a little free time, as on Sundays, when we wore only our overseas caps. These we called our dinky caps, and I have an idea that the song, Hinky Dinky Parlez-vous, originated from this cap. Considerable time was spent every day with gas mask drills, and after a while we got so that we could put on our masks in a couple of seconds. We had to carry these masks at all times, no matter where we went. 5 kinds of gas were at that time in common use by the enemy. I shall enumerate them briefly. Tear gas, named for its reaction on the tear glands of the eyes. Non-poisonous, but painful and highly annoying. Sneezing gas, so termed because of its irritating reaction on the membranes of the nose and head. A few whiffs would throw the victim into violent fits of sneezing. The Germans had the habit of throwing over the tear and sneezing gas for a time, hoping to render the Allied troops unable to keep their masks on, then would follow up with the poisonous varieties. Later we learned a great deal of this practice from experience. Chlorine gas, a suffocating gas, highly poisonous. Phosgene gas, having the odor of musty hay. Very poisonous. Mustard gas, so named from its smell, which strongly resembled that of ordinary mustard. The fumes from the mustard were not dangerously poisonous, unless inhaled at close range, but the liquid was one of the most cruel weapons of the war. The gas was fired in special shells, which burst with little noise, in the hope that the liquid, which was yellowish in color, might splash over the victim, burning him with such violence that no cure at that time was known for it. Some of the most pitiful cases we saw later were men whose faces and bodies had been burned with this merciless liquid called mustard gas. We were told, further, that gas was sent over enemy lines in 2 ways, by the cloud method, which meant that it was simply liberated from huge tanks when the wind was right, and by shell, meaning that the gas was mixed with other ingredients and fired by artillery. To add to the job, we were presented with gas masks for the horses. The mask was a flannel hood arrangement saturated with hexamine, and had a pad inside which fitted into the animal's mouth like a bit. The hood covered the horse's nostrils and almost reached to his eyes. Along came instruction in adjusting respirators on horses. We were told of the value of horses, how scarce they were, and informed that a horse was worth 4 men. Our government could get a soldier by sending out a postcard, but the procurance of a horse was not such an easy task. So, in case of a gas attack, the mask was first to be put on the helpless animal, the men being a secondary consideration. At first it was a cinch putting the masks on the chevaux, for they thought they were feed bags, but they could not be fooled a sec on time. After experimenting a few times with mules, balky horses, and the meek little stallions, most of the men resolved that in the case of a real gas attack, they were going to use their own judgment. The winter of 1917 was among the worst in memory, both in the United States and in France. For the doughboys, living in drafty barns and chicken coops, short on supplies of all kinds, the weather was especially cruel. Day after day the soldiers awoke to a cold drizzle of rain interspersed with sleet storms and later by snow. Mud, snow, and slush were ankle deep. Wood was scarce and almost impossible to be had. Hobnail shoes treated with grease and oil became pounds heavier with the clay mire of the practice trenches and drill fields. Soldiers roused in their billets of hayloft and barn to find the snow sifted onto their blankets. The frugal French could not understand how much the Americans were accustomed to heat during the winter months, for to them this condition seemed perfectly normal. It became difficult even to get wood for the kitchen fires of the cooks, the wood details being forced to tramp 4 miles to the forests for a meager supply of green sticks, and these always cut under the supervision of an experienced French forester. Even after these details returned, the wood was so green it was difficult to make it burn, and the problem was solved only when these major domos of the kitchen saved the grease from the cooking pots and poured it over the wet logs. Shoes taken off at night would be frozen stiff by morning. To prevent this, many of the boys slept day after day with their shoes on. At night, the boys would take off their shoes and leave them near their bunks. The shoes would freeze, and on several mornings when they could not get them on they were compelled to put a piece of paper in the shoes and set it on fire to melt the ice. They could then pour out the water and put them on. The quartermaster department was not yet functioning properly, and about the only thing received in the way of clothing in large enough quantities were stockings, and the boys unable to get gloves wore stockings on their hands while at drill. With the cold winter there were cases of pneumonia, and deaths among some of the boys belonging to the division. I remember going to the funeral of one of the men from C Battery, to which I was attached. We marched solemnly, led by the band, with the body on a caisson, the coffin covered by an American flag, to a small cemetery outside the post. The band played Chopin's funeral march, usually used by the army. It was impressive, with the volley over the grave and the playing of taps. But the moment the funeral was over and the band started marching back to the camp, they struck up Pop Goes the Weasel. It seemed incongruous, but I was told it was on orders. The funeral was over, and from now on they wanted the men to think of more cheerful things. When every few days they heard the funeral march, the men not in the immediate number of mourners used to sing a parody. Congress had voted that to the relatives of every soldier who died in services overseas would be paid $10,000. The men sang to the tune of the funeral march, $10,000 going back to the folks, $10,000 going back to the folks, they will buy an auto, $10,000 going back to the folks. Automobiles in those days were considered a luxury, not a necessity as now. Gradually, in a score of different ways, the Americans began to obtain some inkling of the seriousness of what lay ahead. Allied soldiers were clearly tired. The civilian population seemed to consist mostly of women dressed in black, doddering old men, cripples or young boys. Beneath their joy at the arrival of the Americans, there was a sense of desperation. Our company was quartered for the night in the village school, the only building large enough to accommodate the horde. The brick floors in that schoolhouse were cold and hard, and the exhausted soldiers twisted about in their blankets and groaned, and wished for the softer earth outside. There was a little pathetic card in one of the classroom, with a list of the Jeans and Gabriels and Pierres, and all the rest of the young village boys who had gone away to serve under the tricolor and had never come back. Mort pour la patrie. I lived in my pup tent with Lou Vinton. Lou was a typical extrovert, full of fun, would shoot craps or play poker until his last cent was gone. He could swear like a pirate and did most of the time. He had not a care in the world, lived each day as it came along and never worried about the future. The first time I noticed a change in Lou was during the train trip from Street Nazir. I had not thought the war had impressed itself on Lou, but one day we were slowly passing through a city and a hospital train on the other track. Through the large windows of each car could be plainly seen the berths occupied by wounded French soldiers, swathed in bandages, many of which were blood-stained. These soldiers were silent, motionless, staring out the windows and right through us. It was like we were not there or we were wax figures. I was standing in the open door of our little freight car with Lou alongside me. All he could say as he saw these victims was, "Oh my. Oh my." We were face to face with the bloody facts of war. It was a sobering experience. As I came to learn more about the way war was being fought, I began to doubt my ever returning to the States. We talked daily with soldiers from the front, and their stories, while they did not disturb us or create in us any fear, did cause a lot of the fellows to look at the whole thing from a sort of fatalistic attitude. I remarked to a British officer that extra rations had been received and that I hated to send them back. He said in a surprised way, "Why should you think of sending them back?" And I answered that if I didn't I would have to pay for them. He said convincingly, "Oh, keep them. You will be bloody well killed before a month." I kept the rations and the Britisher was nearly right. 30 days later I was lying helpless in a shell hole and 60% of the battalion was either killed or wounded.